Hi, my name is Stephanie Arell, and today I'm going to talk briefly about what's called the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. Basically, in terms of thinking about how our bodies respond to trauma. And I'll get into a little bit of thinking about things our bodies do after the event of trauma that replicates those body positions or body postures or physiological responses to trauma, so that you can think about what your own body does in relationship to the experiences that you've had in life that might be difficult or classified as traumatic. So when we undergo a traumatic experience or encounter some event that inspires terror and helplessness, to use Judith Herman's terms, our bodies respond initially from a part of our brain that's called the reptilian brain so there's two different parts, the limbic system. In the limbic system, we have what's called the amygdala and the hippocampus. Basically, the amygdala, which is the part that I'm going to concentrate on in the brain, it's a very basic functioning part of the brain. So it's not involved in our cognitive processes. So it's not related to learning, it's not related to our processing of information, it's not related to our thinking. It's basically our reactions to something, our immediately strong, perhaps physiological reactions to a particular event. When I'm teaching, the example that I like to give to people to understand the amygdala outside of, say, a trauma framework where something's being done to us is if you've ever heard stories about maybe a child falls into ice or something falls on a child and someone reacts immediately without thinking and tries to get the child or save the child. That is a kind of amygdala response. Stories like where people are lifting up a car to free somebody. They're not thinking about how do I do this, they just do it. Their adrenaline is so high and their physiological response is to take action to help. When we undergo trauma, we get the same kind of reaction in terms of the basicness or the more primal elements of the reaction. In that case, we're not talking about somebody helping somebody, we're talking about the physiological response to fear, right? So that physiological response manifests as us immediately running or trying to escape a situation, our fighting, our aggression in the situation, or alternatively, our freezing and doing nothing. If you've ever had a dream where you are in a situation where you can't plead for help or you can't run, that's really kind of gives you a sensation of what it might feel like to freeze. Most people have had dreams like that in processing information while they're dreaming. But when we're thinking about trauma, I think it's helpful to use this framework because it helps us analyze how we recover from trauma or things that we can do to help our body in the recovery. So let me back up and go through each mode of response singularly. Fight response is pretty self-explanatory. It means that you are going to gird yourself, respond with anger, perhaps violence. Again, we've talked about multiple times in this YouTube series that violence can take on many forms. It can be words, it can be thoughts, but the reaction would be just a strong aggression. However that gets manifested may change, but there's an outpouring of defense or protection or wanting to inflict harm. Anything that's kind of motivated in response to the trauma that is a push away or push against, right? Physiologically, you would think about somebody actually fighting somebody else. So that's the fight response. The flight response is more fear motivated than anger motivated, and it's going to lead to the act of running away from, right? Or I'm going to get out of this situation, or I'm going to withdraw, I'm going to go away. Perhaps there is in trauma kind of dissociative element, although I think dissociation can happen in any of the categories, but this idea I'm going to remove myself, I'm going to try not to be in that particular environment. An animal that gets threatened might immediately run. I mean, how many times have you been hiking, for instance, or in any kind of situation out in the wild where an animal sees you and immediately runs away, hides, flies away, whatever? They're afraid. They're afraid of you, so they're going to flee. So then we have the freeze response. So the freeze response is also associated with this idea of dissociation. When people have experiences of gross violence against their physical bodies, what the dissociative defense does is it's a mechanism basically to try to feel as if I'm outside of my body, so that what's happening to my body I don't actually experience in real time. Instead, I'm kind of floating above. That's a dissociative defense mechanism that's actually effective, but over time, if people continue to use that defense in real life outside of the traumatic circumstances, it can cause some symptoms that are uncomfortable. I might talk about that in a later video, but I want to focus on this fight, flight, or freeze as a physiological response. The freeze mechanism is also the idea that you're not capable of moving as a result of feeling terrorized or really intimidated. So it's kind of like perhaps something's happened to you where you've lost words and you have some flush of affect and you can't articulate anything or can't even think of words. That's a freeze mechanism. The idea that you can't move your body or that your body feels completely frozen in time, that's the freeze mechanism. And if we don't want to use the word frozen twice, it would be like the idea that your body is a brick or it's immovable. That's the freeze response. And the idea of the freeze response is if I stay in this tense position or diminish myself as much as possible physically, the threat will no longer perceive me as real, and therefore I'll be safe. Now, what's interesting about these three responses is they have a physiology associated with them, or a body posture that we take. So in the fight response, the position's going to be, I'm defending myself here and I'm kind of in a squat, right? So I'm in this kind of position. In the flee, I'm in a position of running. And if you think about it in terms of animals, usually they're on all fours. We are two-legged mammals, so we might run, but that's still, the position is to contract the front of the hips and move as fast as possible away. And the freeze mechanism is basically turning into a ball. So all three positions require a flexion or a closure in the hip joint. Why I say that is that there's the muscle that is also involved in this physiological brain, both response, and that muscle is called the psoas, and it basically is what closes the hip joint. It's used in running, it's used in drawing your knees into your chest, and it's also used in this kind of half-bent physical posture that's pretty effective if you're literally thinking of fighting somebody. I've done a lot of work with people that have had some physical reaction to trauma, and almost invariably that psoas muscle gets locked up in their bodies. And I have found that working on that muscle can relieve the stress throughout the body in relationship to the trauma response. However, that muscle, once released, creates a feeling of vulnerability in the body, and that vulnerability is a real thing. So how you can think about this outside of a sort of physical framework is that when we don't have a fight, flight, or freeze, basically we're a little bit vulnerable to all of the things that happen around us because we're softer, right? We're not fear-basing our responses to things. And I think that's really important to think about in terms of recovery. If trauma happens to you and you have a fight, flight, or freeze response, that response is going to be kind of conditioned in you or be something that you might return to because it feels safer than being vulnerable. And in some cases, it might be right because there might be a real threat. But in a lot of cases, it's more about something reminding you or triggering a past memory in present circumstances that then leads to one of these three responses that's not really highly adaptable to the present situation. I'll think about it just as a psychological phenomenon for now, but later I'll do a video on the psoas and the concept of how that works with traumatic injury, whether that trauma is psychological or physical. If we can identify a little bit better whether stressful or traumatic stimuli or stimuli that resembles a past trauma leads us to fight, flight, or freeze, or even when we're engaging in any of the three, then we can start to make decisions about the fact that we're not threatened any longer, that we are in a safe space, more or less, depending on the circumstances, of course, and can make some cognitive decisions about how we respond that overcomes the initial physiological response that really was used to keep us safe in the beginning. So a lot of ways that psychologists will talk about this is that we have responses to traumatic content, and those responses keep us safe, but over time they actually might be maladaptive, so they might not continue to work for us. So it's important to think, like, what is this response, and does it work now, or was it really better used in the past and actually I don't need it anymore? That takes some cognitive activity. That's quite outside of that amygdala response that I talked about initially. And I do think the two kind of intertwine so that they're not completely divorced, but we can start to have thoughts that can help our amygdala not respond so quickly into that fight, flight, or freeze mechanism.